From a legendary Brazilian racer speeding toward one of the darkest moments in sports history, to a routine flight that turned tragic when its disturbed co-pilot took control. 24 clips, 7 levels. These are the most disturbing TV broadcasts ever to air. Let's start at the tip of the iceberg. And that's not even the craziest story on this iceberg. But before we plunge even deeper, check this out. It's a yearbook photo of my grandmother from the early 1900s, and I discovered it thanks to the incredible sponsors of this video, MyHeritage. If you've ever felt the itch to explore your roots like I have, MyHeritage is the perfect way to uncover those hidden gems. With over 90 million users, MyHeritage is the go-to site for diving into your family history. You can build your family tree, find out where you came from, and even discover some long-lost relatives. It's like a giant family reunion at the click of a button. To get started with your story on MyHeritage, click the link in the description or scan the QR code on the screen, and guess what? You get 14 days free to try it out. I did, and building my family tree was incredibly easy. All I had to do was sign up on myheritage.com with my name and surname, James Miller, my full date of birth, and my place of birth. The next step was to fill in my magic 7. That's me, my parents, and my 4 grandparents. Adding these 7 people is enough for MyHeritage to find an instant discovery and start growing your family tree automatically. Once I hit done, MyHeritage instantly found matches connected to my family tree, and I was able to easily add them with just a click. It was amazing seeing my family tree start expanding in seconds. What's more, MyHeritage has a massive database of over 36 billion historical documents to sift through and find records of your family members. I was able to find a yearbook photo of my grandmother back when she was a sprightly teenager. She was so excited because she had lost hers years ago. But that's not even the coolest thing on MyHeritage. I got to see old grainy pictures of my great-grandparents come to life using an AI feature. It not only allowed me to put color in the old photos, but I also got to animate them. Cool, right? Ready to discover the real you? Get a 14-day free trial for MyHeritage using the link in the description or by scanning the QR code on screen. Level 1. On-stage death of Tommy Cooper. Tommy Cooper was one of the most recognizable comedians in the UK. He gained popularity through his prop comedy, with his running gag being that most of his tricks would go wrong. His clumsy persona and infectious laughter became his defining features, making him a household name across the country. On April 15, 1984, Cooper was on the stage of Her Majesty's Theatre in London for his most crucial performance, a live broadcast for the variety show Live from Her Majesty's. He walked on stage wearing his signature fez and began a routine where he struggled to put on his cloak. For Cooper and his audience, this was completely normal and started just like any other show. The audience just laughed at his struggle. However, the conventional routine became inextricably linked to the accident he sustained immediately afterward. Something that became one of the most haunting things to be captured on live television. They didn't realize what was actually happening. Within seconds, the tone of the skit changed when Cooper fell down and slumped against the backdrop. Even then, the audience was blissfully unaware that he was actually having a heart attack and was struggling to keep himself upright. Once again, they erupted in laughter while the comedian was agonally breathing on the floor. The show was a live broadcast, with the entire nation watching it. While the production crew did quickly realize something wasn't right, the very fact that it was a live transmission prevented them from intervening immediately. They sadly had to wait for a few seconds before cutting to a commercial break. As soon as it started, they rushed Cooper to Westminster Hospital, but sadly it was too late, and Tommy Cooper was pronounced dead shortly after arriving at the hospital. The tragedy was broadcast to millions on air, with so many of them not even realizing they were watching their beloved comedian take his last breaths. And while one might argue that he died doing what he loved, no one can deny that despite the poetic undertones of his death, it was still exceptionally tragic and haunting. Iranian state TV hack. 2022. In October 2022, the Iranian state-backed brutality that had been festering in the country finally boiled over during a live show that was broadcast to the entire country. Iran had been going through a period of widespread unrest due to a nationwide protest. It started due to the death of Mahsa Amini, a young woman who had been arrested by Iran's morality police for wearing her head covering improperly. According to sources, she had been brutally beaten by the authorities before being forcefully taken into custody. Tragically, her injuries from the confrontation led to her death 3 days later. That's when the people of Iran took to the streets against the government. Iranian leadership tried whatever they could to control the situation, including restricting media coverage and cutting internet access. At the peak of the tension, the entire country was struck by something they'd never expected. In the middle of the evening news on a state-run network, the broadcast was suddenly interrupted by a group of anonymous hackers who ran a protest on live TV. The group, Adalat-e-Ali, or Ali's Justice, broadcast a still poster of the Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, surrounded by flames. Below his image were 3 young women who had been victims of state brutality after Mahsa. The poster was captioned, "The blood of our youth is on your hands." The entire ordeal lasted only a few seconds, but was enough to cause havoc. Recordings of it went viral online, ultimately making those few seconds the face of the campaign. After the hack, Iranian authorities launched an internal investigation, but nothing could come out of it, and the entire thing was blamed on foreign enemies trying to cause interstate disruptions. South African Parliament fire. On the morning of January 2nd, 2022, a major fire broke out in South Africa's parliamentary building in Cape Town. At first, it felt like a routine fire brigade job, the kind they probably handled every day, but within minutes, the flames spread out, completely engulfing the complex. It burned for an entire day and was completely out of control before it was finally put out. Initially, investigations reported that the fire had started in the old Parliament building. No one could have guessed it would spread to devastate the new one as well. And the timing could not have been worse. Because of certain nationwide events, the Parliament was relatively quiet with only a few guards and staff on duty. When the fire alarms went off the first time around, there was barely anyone present to handle it. To make matters worse, the sprinklers never activated because the valve controlling them had been closed. The fire raged on for 24 hours, and by the time it was contained, the country's most important landmark was already in ruins. By the end, the old building not only had an entire roof collapse, but also had most of its offices and its gymnasium completely burnt. Police later arrested a 49-year-old man, Zandilfe Mafe, who was found inside the premises around the time the fire started. He was charged with arson and theft, but was eventually committed to a mental hospital on account of being diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Investigations later uncovered even more layers of failure. It was revealed that Parliament's sprinkler systems hadn't been serviced in years. In addition to that, most emergency doors were left open in the building, which aided in the spread of the fire even more. But thankfully, most historic artifacts inside were later reported to be safe. Since then, restoration has been in full force, set to be completed this year. Anonymous attacks on Russian media. February 22nd marked the start of one of the most significant events of the 21st century. It was the month when Russia launched a full-scale invasion on Ukraine, initiating a war that is still going on to this day. However, with an event this big, there were bound to be certain ripple effects that shaped the course of what followed. Because this war unfolded in the age of social media, digital propaganda and online information became another front line. Just days after Russia invaded Ukraine, the hacktivist group known as Anonymous announced that they were launching a cyber war against the Russian government. Within hours, it began taking open responsibility for cyber attacks on various state-backed media websites and news outlets. Soon after, what initially seemed like a completely unregulated series of attacks by independent hackers started to connect. Anonymous leaked massive amounts of sensitive data from government ministries and arms companies supporting the Russian military. Major outlets like RT and state news agencies went offline for hours, and in certain extreme cases, broadcasts were hijacked and replaced with footage of Ukrainian destruction and anti-war slogans like, "On your hands is the blood of thousands of Ukrainians and their hundreds of children. TV and the authorities are lying. No to war." Many people tried to downplay the attacks to make it seem like anything but a coordinated effort to thwart the Russian invasion, but things took a serious turn when Putin himself began to be personally affected by the entire ordeal. His private superyacht was reportedly hacked by a group associated with Anonymous. The only thing they did was troll him by setting the yacht's destination to hell and changing the vehicle's call sign to FKPTN. Fuck Putin. In the grand scheme of things, it was still unprecedented. In the moments that followed, Anonymous continued to claim responsibility for new breaches, but these were quickly brought under control by the Russian representatives. However, despite how minimal the impact might have been, Anonymous taking part in cyber warfare against a nation showed how vulnerable most controlled media networks were. Level 2. Mexican News Earthquake Shake 2017. On September 19, 2017, Mexico was struck with one of the most intense earthquakes in the country's contemporary history. At around 1:14 p.m. local time, the entire country began to shake with tremors that reached 7.1 on the Richter scale. Naturally, the timing of the quake allowed it to be caught on multiple live news shows on the local networks. One of the most prominent moments from the devastation was caught in a now famous news clip from the local channel Foro TV. A senior anchor at the channel was in the middle of reading his midday report when the entire studio began to rumble uncontrollably. Within seconds, the completely normal, everyday news segment turned into something straight out of a movie. When the earthquake hit the studio, its intensity could be gauged by the main camera's movements. It began to shake abnormally, and the studio lights started to flicker on and off. The anchor, who was initially composed and possibly couldn't perceive the intensity of the shake, apologized and left the news desk instantly. But the worst was far from over. After the anchor had left the studio, the camera panned to the scene outside the studio, which showed how absolutely disastrous the earthquake actually was. The shaking on a heavily controlled and mounted camera was so significant that the visuals were almost completely imperceptible. A bird's eye view of the empty studio was eventually shown, with the massive overhead lights swinging like pendulums. The moment was broadcast to millions across Mexico. It became a raw, unfiltered, and real-time look into the actual destruction of the quake. It was devastating, killing more than 350 people and leaving thousands displaced and injured. Entire buildings collapsed, leaving victims stuck beneath the rubble for days. The visuals that came out of the event were absolutely heartbreaking. People were seen digging through the debris and rubble with their bare hands to save any potential survivors. The clip from Foro TV was praised worldwide for not being cut. It showed the world the unfiltered reality of what people across the country were experiencing, allowing everyone to empathize with it. Level 3. Kent State Shooting, 1970. The Vietnam War and America's subsequent involvement in it led to certain events that changed the course of history. Its consequences are ultimately still being remembered to this day, and one such consequence was the Kent State shooting on May 4th, 1970. Just days earlier, students at Kent State University in Ohio had been protesting the Vietnam War and the US's invasion of Cambodia. These were some intense protests, but nothing unexpected for organized events. They had been happening all through the country, and the authorities were well aware of their nature. But at Kent, things had spiraled out of control. There were reports of violent clashes between students and local police. According to witnesses, students had been throwing rocks and empty bottles at cop cars and were disrupting everyday traffic by starting fires in the middle of the roads. The demonstrations had started to become so intense that it was now out of the local police's hands. The Ohio National Guard had to be called into the area. This was the moment that marked the start of a confrontation so intense and one-sided it potentially ended in President Nixon's downfall. The fateful May 4th protest started off as completely peaceful, with protesters simply gathering around. Like any other demonstration, speakers and activists were delivering fierce speeches to a crowd of almost 3,000 protesters and spectators. They spoke out against the presence of the National Guard and the overall impact of the U.S.'s involvement in the Vietnam War. Standard protest stuff, really. However, things veered off course drastically when the National Guard General, Robert Canterbury, unexpectedly ordered all the protesters to call the protest off and disperse. And because energies and emotions were high, their refusal to do so resulted in both sides clashing violently. Protesters began to throw rocks at the guardsmen, who responded by using tear gas on them. Then, just as things started to look better, a group of soldiers turned around and fired point blank at the crowd. It lasted just 13 seconds. But in that short interval, over 60 rounds were fired, 4 people lost their lives, and 9 were injured. All those who were shot were students at good standing in the university. The archival footage and images that came out of the protest are still some of the most stark examples of state brutality. One image, which later won the Pulitzer Award, shows a student, Mary Vecchio, kneeling over the dead body of Jeffrey Miller, one of the victims. It was a tragedy that is, to this day, embedded in the legacy of the U.S. Space Shuttle Challenger. On January 28, 1986, the entirety of America gathered around their television screens to watch the launch of the Space Shuttle Challenger. Being NASA's 25th shuttle mission, and the first to include a civilian, it was meant to be a proud moment for the entire country. The civilian in question was a school teacher, Krista McAuliffe, who had won her place on the shuttle through NASA's Teachers in Space program. She had stood out among the 11,000 applicants and was one of the main reasons so many people were excited about this mission. Sadly, even with so many prayers and good wishes, there were concerns behind the scene. The launch had already been delayed several times due to technical issues and bad atmospheric conditions. The extremely cold weather had caused certain parts of the spaceship to freeze over, which was worrying enough, but even more so was the fact that this same shuttle had failed multiple experimental launches over the years. Nevertheless, it was still allowed to take off on the fateful day with 7 crew members on board. The broadcast naturally didn't mention any behind-the-scenes activity, so viewers only saw the countdown, the liftoff, and the cloud of smoke cutting through the sky. However, the broadcast caught something unexpected only 73 seconds into its flight. The shuttle suddenly erupted into a cloud of smoke, splitting into 2 trails mid-air. For a few seconds, the entire world was stunned into silence. Even the Mission Control Center wasn't sure what just happened. The crowd below kept cheering, believing this was part of some standard flight procedure. However, a few seconds in, someone from Mission Control finally announced that the vehicle had just exploded, and that they were checking in with the recovery forces to see what could be done at this point. Unfortunately, the fates of all 7 people aboard the shuttle had been sealed. The feed kept going and showed pieces of the vehicle falling into the ocean. Within minutes, the celebration had turned into one of the most haunting live broadcasts in television history. After 3 months of extensive recovery and search efforts, the crew compartment was recovered with human remains still inside. It was later deduced that several of the crew members had been alive during the initial explosion, but they sadly could not survive the impact with the ocean floor. In the aftermath, NASA suspended all shuttle missions. Investigations revealed that a failed O-ring seal in one of these solid rocket boosters had caused the disaster. A tragedy that is still remembered and condemned to this day. Level 4. Tyre Nichols beating. On January 7, 2023, at around 8:30 p.m., 5 officers from the Memphis Police Department's Scorpion unit pulled over a 29-year-old man. The man in question was Tyron Nichols, who was apparently stopped for an alleged reckless driving charge. But by 9:18 p.m., Nichols was admitted to a nearby hospital on the verge of losing his life. Whatever happened during those few moments of confrontation between the 29-year-old and the cops ultimately ended in the young man's death. Tyron Nichols was a FedEx employee and photographer from Memphis who was simply driving home after a hard day at work. He was only 2 minutes away from his mother's house when he was stopped by the MPD. The initial body cam that was later released seemed all over the place. It showed officers shouting conflicting commands at the victim as he tried to comply. And after being tackled and pepper sprayed several times, he eventually broke free and tried to run. Naturally, that didn't sit right with the officers, who chased him down the street and began hitting him with batons and tasers. The footage basically showed 5 officers surrounding a completely helpless man, taking turns hitting, kicking, and beating him, all while Nichols was crying out helplessly for his mother. A few moments later, he was completely limp and was propped against the side of a police car. The 5 officers stood around him and discussed their harsh treatment of him in grim detail as the poor man took his last breaths. The medics arrived soon after, but refused to give Nichols the help he needed. He was taken to the hospital almost 16 minutes after his assault. Tyron Nichols died 3 days later in the hospital, and the footage sparked nationwide outrage and protest. The officers involved were fired and charged with second-degree murder. Ceausescu execution. Romania's last dictator, Nicolae Ceausescu, had ruled the country with an iron fist for more than 20 years. Although he had been comparatively less strict of a communist ruler in the early years of his tenure, it changed drastically later on. He controlled the country and its people purely through fear and oppression, which he would employ very generously. Nicolae was not afraid to use fascist tactics like his secret police to illegally detain anyone and everyone who opposed him. He also did not care about the well-being of the common man. His utterly destructive policies for rebuilding Bucharest into a contemporary city were a perfect example of this, coming at the expense of its century-old infrastructure. He took loans, drained the country's finances dry, and even made basic necessities expensive just to see his dream through. However, what truly marked the beginning of his end was not his tyrannical policies, but the absolute horrors he committed in the town of Timișoara. What started as a small protest over local grievances in Timișoara became a full-blown anti-government demonstration hours later. Naturally, a dictator like Nicolae didn't take well to being questioned, so instead of talking it out, he ordered an absolute massacre of the locals at the hands of the military and his secret police. Multiple men, women, and children were killed by open fire, and their bodies were reportedly dumped in mass graves. That was the beginning of a few days' revolution which ended with Nicolae being removed from office in the most abrupt way possible. He initially organized a mass gathering in Bucharest as a way to re-establish the people's support for him. But that backfired completely when the originally pro-Ceausescu rally turned completely anti-Ceausescu. They totally rejected his claims of anti-Romanian powers causing unrest and began to boo him off the stage on live TV. That moment was then immortalized as one of the most important events in Romanian history. After that, things changed for Nicolae, his wife Ilana, and Romania very drastically. On December 25th, the couple faced an unnaturally hastily arranged trial that was broadcast, yet again, on national television. In under an hour, both of them were charged with genocide and gathering of wealth. Elena and Nicolae Ceausescu were consequently sentenced to death by a firing squad. They were bound by their hands and were escorted outside with the entire country watching them through their TV screens. They were executed with automatic rifles before they could even make sense of what was happening to them. It was the moment that marked the beginning of some sort of normalcy for the Romanian people, but but the ramifications of Nikolai's rule and his execution are still being felt to this day. Rodney King beating aftermath riots, 1992. On March 19, 1991, a bystander in Los Angeles captured a scene that would soon end up causing one of the biggest riots in America. The video showed 4 LAPD officers repeatedly hitting an unarmed black man named Rodney King with batons, while he lay on the ground semi-unconscious. The sheer force used on King was enough to cause a nationwide outrage when the footage was aired on national television. Naturally, it became a symbol of police brutality and racial inequality. In an ideal world, it would have been enough to get the 4 officers severe sentences. After all, it showed the victim being horrifically struck by the 4 officers more than 50 times, while a large group of them stood around hurling insults at him. However, when the officers did go for their trial in 1992, all 4 of them were acquitted. That moment marked the beginning of one of the most violent riots in American history. Within hours of the verdict, the entire cities of Los Angeles erupted. The media coverage of the riots was extensive and showed every single angle. People were understandably angry, but certain moments went way too far. Buildings were being lit on fire, shops were being looted, and completely innocent bystanders were being made targets. One widely broadcast example was when truck driver Reginald Denny was dragged from his vehicle and beaten by rioters at an intersection. Thankfully, he was saved by kind strangers who instantly rushed him to the hospital. For 6 days, TV networks aired the destruction almost non-stop. When order was finally restored 6 days later, Los Angeles looked unrecognizable. More than 2,300 people were injured, around 12,000 were arrested, and damages exceeded $1 billion. Sadly, 60 people also lost their lives. While that did finally start a much-needed conversation about racial inequality in the country's law enforcement, it also came with a very high cost. Level 5. O.J. Simpson Bronco Chase. The TV was showing regular Friday evening programming on June 17, 1994, when everything suddenly switched to surreal footage of a car chase. Everything from normal shows to sports coverage and even the NBA Finals were interrupted. It was the live broadcast of a white Ford Bronco moving down a Los Angeles freeway with dozens of police cars behind it. Inside the vehicle was the former football star, actor, and now wanted man, O.J. Simpson. He was on the run after failing to turn himself in to the police and ended up the target of a manhunt. But unlike a normal high-speed chase, this one was not speeding along. The Bronco just crawled along the highway at around 64 kilometers per hour, followed live by news helicopters broadcasting to nearly 95 million viewers. It was driven by Simpson's friend A.C. Cowlings, while he himself was in the back with a gun in his hand. All throughout the chase, Simpson held a gun to his own head and threatened to pull the trigger unless he was taken to his house. Eventually, the public finally caught a whiff of what was happening and began lining up in the overpass, waving and holding signs as the cars passed. On the other hand, police were constantly negotiating with Simpson over the phone so that he would turn himself in. Everything finally calmed down after more than an hour when Simpson's car finally pulled into his Brentwood home. He stepped out and was promptly taken into custody. By the end of the night, the chase had become one of the most watched live events in television history. Simpson was eventually acquitted, but ended up having a very complex history with law enforcement. Although his dream team of lawyers managed to create significant doubt with the jury, most people still believe he was fully guilty of the murder of his ex-wife and her friend. Munich Olympics attack. The 1972 Munich Olympics was the first Olympics held in Germany since 1936. It was supposed to be a gesture of rebuilding and peace after the World Wars, but ended up being one of the most devastating events in history. In the early hours of September 5, 1972, 8 men dressed in tracksuits climbed over a fence carrying duffel bags with rifles and grenades. They were part of a terrorist group, Black September, and had plans of taking the Israeli teams hostage as a part of a release plea for Palestinian prisoners. They entered the Israeli team's quarters in the early hours of the morning as the athletes were sleeping. 2 of the hostages were killed early on during the struggle, while the other 9 were taken alive. Within minutes, a large number of police and journalists crowded outside the building trying to make sense of the situation. However, one thing was clear. Since the situation was being broadcast live, the attackers could see everything too. So most rescue attempts ended in failure because of the very public dissemination of information. Eventually, negotiations started with the kidnappers that stretched through the entire day. They demanded safe passage to Egypt through a plane where they would exchange the hostages. Law enforcement feigned agreement with these demands, but the actual plan was for the terrorists and hostages to be escorted to Fürstenfeldbruck Air Base, where they would be rescued. However, at the Fürstenfeldbruck Air Base, the rescue attempt failed miserably. There were no trained snipers, and they lacked a proper chain of command, which escalated the situation beyond belief. The operation ended with all 9 hostages dead, along with a German officer and 5 of the attackers. And 3 others were captured alive. In total, it was a complete and utter tragedy that ended with 17 people dead. Although the games resumed after a memorial service, the broadcasts had already been etched into history. Ayrton Senna crash. The 1994 San Marino Grand Prix was already under intense scrutiny after driver Roland Ratzenberger lost his life during qualifying. Despite most people not being comfortable with the tournament taking place, it went ahead anyway. Naturally, for a competition as popular as the Grand Prix, millions of people tuned in from all over the world to watch it live. Ratzenberger's death had cast a dark shadow, and everyone was hoping for things to return to normal with the upcoming matches. However, what happened next became one of the worst events to ever happen in a Grand Prix. Ayrton Senna was a legendary Brazilian race car driver who was known and loved all around the world. He was a 3-time world champion who was on his way to cement his legacy by moving to the Williams-Renault team. Sadly, the car had problems that would later end up reshaping F1 racing itself. On the 7th lap of the race, Ayrton Senna's car rounded the corner at more than 300 kilometers per hour. He was still in the lead and would have possibly won the race if not for the unforeseen tragedy. As Senna approached the corner, some mechanical error prevented it from turning properly. That caused the car to crash fatally into the concrete wall. The impact was so violent and sudden that resulting debris flew all over the track and spectator area. When the smoke finally dissipated and the camera panned to Senna, it was clear something was wrong. Everyone had expected him to climb out or at least make some sort of movement to indicate that he was fine. However, he was completely still and only twitched slightly once, which people assumed was most likely his last breath. One of Senna's front wheels had snapped loose and struck his helmet, causing a fatal skull fracture. While the area was sealed off by marshals almost instantly, it took the medical team more than 3 minutes to reach Senna. They tried to give him first aid, but it was already too late. He was airlifted to Bologna's Maggiore Hospital, where doctors declared him dead at 6:40 p.m. local time. He was only 34. The crash became one of the most widely viewed live tragedies in sports history. In total, the weekend left 2 drivers dead and several others injured. This was finally the point when new safety standards were introduced into F1. It wouldn't be until 2014 that another driver, Jules Bianchi, would suffer injuries at the Japanese Grand Prix that would later claim his life. Nepal protests 2025. On September 4th, 2025, Nepalese government declared that 26 social media platforms, including Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, YouTube, and X, would be banned in the country unless they registered with authorities. For most Nepali people, this was a clear sign of tyrannical rule. Politicians that were already widely accused of corruption and favoritism. Since most young people depended on online workspaces for their livelihoods, it was seen as a direct attack on their financial stability. And considering how Nepal's median age is 25, a large part of its population was job-seeking Generation Z. These young people refused to give in to the government's absurd policies. As a result, mass protests were organized all over the country, predominantly consisting of Gen Zers. Soon enough, these demonstrations went beyond the social media problem and turned fully anti-government. Nepali people simply wanted accountability, less corruption, and better governance from their leaders. But as history has shown time and again, accountability has never sat right with politicians. So instead of conceding to their people's demands, the Nepali government put up barriers to thwart the protests. Police and law enforcement agencies were deployed that used tear gas, water cannons, and rubber bullets on their own people. Tensions kept rising as the crowd refused to give up and pushed against barricades, both metaphorically and physically. Tragically, water cannons and rubber bullets were the mildest tactics the state deployed against its people. On September 8th, when protesters attempted to breach the parliament complex, forces responded with live ammunition. At least 19 people were killed and over 100 injured in these clashes. Later on, the number of deaths rose to 75, with more than 2,000 people injured. It was later reported that most of the casualties were because of trauma to the head, chest, abdomen, and neck. And tragically, at least one of the victims was a 12-year-old child. The aftermath of the massacre was almost instant, and it was widely covered by national and international media. Prime Minister K.P. Sharma Oli immediately resigned and fled to an army barracks. This resulted in the quick formation of an interim government. Chief Justice Sushali Karki was appointed as the first female prime minister who was to be in charge until elections in early 2026. But for the victims and their families, there has been little meaningful relief. After all, losing your life while simply employing your basic right to freedom of speech is a tragedy. Level 6. Nodar Kurmaratashvili Crash. The men's luge event at the 2010 Winter Olympics hadn't even officially started when a devastating tragedy struck. It was still training day at the Whistler Sliding Center, with the opening ceremony being only hours away. The track was known to be dangerously fast, and several athletes had already raised safety concerns. It was so bad at times that practice speeds for some athletes were reaching well over 150 kilometers per hour, considerably higher than what the track was built for. Although there had been accidents on it before, it was Nodar Kurmaratashvili, a 21-year-old luger from Georgia competing in his first Olympics, who ended up losing his life. Nodar was doing his final practice run and had been traveling at the speed of approximately 140 kilometers per hour. And even in the footage of him sliding down the track, you can clearly see that those speeds are far from normal, all beside the track. The live broadcast was cut away immediately, but by the time medics had reached Kurmaratashvili, it was already too late. They tried to resuscitate him to no avail and had him airlifted to a hospital. However, he was pronounced dead on arrival. Officials later confirmed the fatal impact and modified the track the next day. And while they insisted that the track was perfectly safe, they still raised barriers and shortened the start to reduce the speed for the peace of mind of the athletes. A coroner's report also confirmed that a mix of factors, including technical difficulties and Kurmaratashvili's unfamiliarity with the track, caused his death. Nodar Kurmaratashvili's death remains one of the darkest moments ever shown from the Olympics. Germanwings crash site, 2015. When Germanwings Flight 9525 took off from Barcelona on March 24, 2015, everything seemed routine. The pilots were experienced, and the flight path was one that the crew had taken countless times, so it seemed nothing whatsoever could go wrong. However, midway through the journey, the plane began to descend dramatically. Initially, air traffic controllers assumed it was a technical issue and tried getting to the bottom of it. However, there was no distress sign or turbulence at all, and the descent looked too controlled to be accidental. In other words, the plane was quite literally just falling down. The plane started its descent from 3,000 meters to 100 meters and eventually struck the French Alps at full speed. All 150 passengers were killed almost instantly. The visuals that came out of the crash site after the fact showed nothing that resembled an aircraft. It had been obliterated, leaving only dust and debris. When the black box was found, the reality of the situation finally came to light. Andreas Lubitz was the co-pilot of the plane and was ultimately responsible for the accident. He had been struggling with severe depression and had been deemed unfit to fly, except he managed to somehow hide the diagnosis from his employers and was an active member of the crew. This ended up becoming the reason that 150 innocent souls lost their lives. Lubitz had convinced his captain to take a break just before landing while he would handle the plane. And when he did leave the cockpit, Lubitz locked it behind him, refusing to open it. The captain pounded on the door, tried emergency override, and even shouted at Lubitz to open up. The cockpit recorder later captured his voice growing more desperate as the plane continued to fall towards imminent destruction. The passengers were initially completely unaware of what was going on and only began screaming in the final moments. Investigators would later find that Lubitz had deliberately set the autopilot to descend into the mountainside. French rescuers and investigators later described the crash site as one of the most difficult recovery operations in aviation history. In the weeks that followed, airlines worldwide revised cockpit protocols to make sure no pilot would ever be left alone inside again. Regardless of that, 150 people lost their lives in an act that appeared utterly senseless. Grenfell Tower Fire. The fire at Grenfell Tower was a small one that had started as a kitchen fire in a fourth-floor apartment. It was the kind that would have otherwise been handled easily by the fire brigade, if not for the factors that made it uncontrollable. The tower's window insulation was highly combustible and allowed the fire to spread quickly. Within minutes, the flames reached the outside of the building and began to rapidly move upwards through the higher floors. But because it was a high-rise fire, most residents were told to stay where they were. That was the normal protocol, and nobody thought to change it. Most victims had been stuck on their floors and most likely died of carbon monoxide poisoning before the fire even reached them. All the while, the entire incident was being broadcast live to the entire world. By the morning of June 14, 2017, most of the building had burned to a crisp. 72 people were confirmed dead and many others were injured. Investigations later found that the cladding had failed multiple safety tests and that concerns about fire risks were promptly ignored every time they were raised. In other words, it was a cost-cutting measure that ended up taking the lives of almost 100 people. Even after the fire, there were no clear lines of accountability. The massive public inquiry that was initiated as a result is still ongoing, with the victims still waiting for criminal charges and final justice. Marikana Massacre, South Africa. The Marikana Massacre began as a simple strike about a wage dispute between mine workers and the mining company, Lonmin. Around 3,000 mine workers from the Lonmin Platinum Mine in Marikana, South Africa, had gathered to demand better pay. The strike was non-union backed, which basically left the miners to their own devices. In a show of desperation rather than aggression, they had stood their ground for days, armed symbolically with sticks and machetes. This was quite common in the area and shouldn't have been a threat in most situations. Their lack of union support, however, put them in a very vulnerable place. It technically made these demonstrations wildcat strikes. That's why presiding authorities and law enforcement took these people as dangerous. Police numbers grew, armored vehicles were employed, and a deadly standoff brewed. What started as a labor dispute began to look like a military operation. Earlier clashes had already left 10 people dead, including miners and 2 police officers, ultimately giving rise to animosity on both sides. Sadly, only one side was armed to the teeth and held all the power. On August 16, 2012, the strikers stood near the rocky outcrop known as the Kopi, where they were surrounded by police. They were locked in the area with barbed wire and were eventually tear-gassed. This was followed by more deadly force, including stun guns and ultimately live gunfire. Within minutes, 34 miners were killed and 78 were injured. The live footage showed bodies falling and officers advancing as if in a conventional war. It became a massacre marked by the deadliest use of force by the South African police since the apartheid. Officials initially called it self-defense, but this was soon debunked when images of dead miners were found, with weapons planted posthumously. Survivors understandably called it an execution. The inquiries that followed dragged on for years and revealed immense foul play and failed police strategy. It exposed a reality in a country that had already faced its fair share of violence at the expense of its natives. Level 7. Indian Ocean Tsunami. On December 26, 2004, a massive undersea earthquake measuring 9.1 on the Richter scale struck off the coast of Sumatra, Indonesia. It was one of the most powerful earthquakes recorded in 40 years and instantly gave rise to concerns about the after effects. The scientists had feared a series of tsunamis resulting from the shake spread across the Indian Ocean. These tsunamis hit coastal areas in Indonesia, Sri Lanka, India, Thailand, and as far as East Africa within hours. Entire coastlines were swallowed with massive waves as high as 30 meters, striking with little to no warning. In Indonesia's Aceh province alone, more than 160,000 people died. The death toll in other countries looked just as bad. Sri Lanka lost around 35,000 people. In India, more than 16,000 died, and finally Thailand lost over 8,000 people, many of them tourists. Across 14 countries, the death toll exceeded 230,000, and millions were left without a home. The destruction was so widespread that massive communities and villages simply vanished in the blink of an eye. Piles of bodies were found kilometers inland, and the live visuals of the waves practically looked like CGI. The flattened towns and mass graves shown in the aftermath stunned the world. Nice Truck Attack 2016. The night of July 14th, 2016 was supposed to be a celebration for the French people. After all, it was Bastille Day, and thousands had gathered in the Promenade des Anglais in Nice to watch the Bastille Day fireworks. However, the situation abruptly deteriorated when a 19-ton cargo truck appeared at the edge of the crowd. Instead of stopping, the vehicle accelerated and drove through the crowd of people for nearly 2 kilometers. Within minutes, cheers had turned into screams, and the celebration had become a massacre. By the time the vehicle came to a halt, 86 people were dead, and more than 400 were injured. The driver, Mohamed Lahoulye Bahoulel, was a Tunisian resident of Nice who was shot and killed by police after a 10-minute standoff. The following morning, news channels around the world replayed the same footage of the truck plowing through the crowds of celebrators as dead bodies fell to the ground. It was the third major terrorist attack to hit France in less than 2 years, following the Charlie Hebdo and Paris attacks. And, considering how the day was particularly special for the French people, the tragedy simply deepened a sense of national grief that was already heavy. Investigations revealed that the attack was premeditated and carefully planned. Boulel had rented the truck days earlier and had scouted the route he would take on the tragic day. He even filled the vehicle with fake weapons and grenades to appear more threatening. Major terrorist organizations claimed responsibility for the attack later on, although official investigations showed no links between them and the perpetrator. Mount St. Helens eruption. On the morning of May 18th, 1980, Mount St. Helens erupted in what would become the deadliest and most destructive volcanic event in U.S. history. The volcano had been active in the past 2 months, with minor eruptions occurring at different intervals. However, an eruption of this magnitude was completely unprecedented. Cameras set up by news crews and geologists had been filming it for weeks in hopes of simply catching a surreal natural phenomenon. Then, at 8:32 a.m., a 5.1 magnitude earthquake caused the entire north face of the volcano to collapse in what became the largest landslide in recorded history. This triggered a series of events that ended with a massive blast that flattened 600 square kilometers of forest in its vicinity. Superheated gas and ash rose up in an eruption column that was measured to be a staggering 24 kilometers. People in the blast zone at the time of eruption didn't have time to react. It killed 57 people, including geologist David Johnston, who set out a final radio message, "Vancouver, Vancouver, this is it," moments before being taken in. Entire rivers were clogged with mud and debris, and the height of the eruption cast darkness over the skies in multiple U.S. states. By the time the eruption ended, the mountain's peak had been reduced by about 400 meters, leaving a 2 kilometers wide crater. The total environmental and infrastructural damage was later calculated at approximately $3.4 billion after adjusting for 2023 inflation. In the following years, the Mount St. Helens eruption became a major site for scientific study. It was also the reason the state recognized the month of May as Volcano Awareness Month. And that wraps up this chilling iceberg. Thanks so much for watching, and make sure you don't miss out on your 14-day free trial at MyHeritage. Just click the link in the description box. Still don't have your fill of disturbing icebergs? Well, check out our other videos for more.